Before I add any difficulty, I'd like to give the gratitude to Richard.
No, I don't. You can
Try very hard to give us hard times by confronting Levinas's difficulty first. So the rest of the seminar will be easy.
Yes.
That's his intention, ethical intention.
There we go.
I think there's two more difficulty to me to read Levinas. Number one is his writing. His writing, his language is very rhetorical. Well, he's the man of nature. So I think it's not difficult. It's notorious difficult to read the Levinas.
Can I qualify your difficulty? I'm sorry.
Okay, it's okay.
I'm sorry. But when I said the universal, I had in my notes what I wanted to say also about Levinas's writing is exactly what you're saying now. Is because it's universal, he assumes that you are familiar with all of Western spirit, all of Western culture. And he doesn't baby his readers so that he alludes to more things than he refers to. Now this is a style of writing at the highest level of culture. It also, I can tell you, is a style of rabbinic writing. So that the rabbis assume that if they use 3 words that are from the Hebrew Bible, everyone knows it. You don't have to say, oh, it's Leviticus 12:14, right? And this is a style also peculiar to French, 20th century French thinking. So you make a reference to, let's say, fundamental history, and everyone, oh, it's Merleau-Ponty, right? You just use a phrase, and everyone gets it. So probably 200 years from now, there'll have to be a annotated, footnoted version of Levinas when these references are no longer alive. But so much of his stuff, that's what I put under the universal, is exactly what you were saying. But I wouldn't. When you say rhetoric, let me add something. Is that although it looks like Levinas has a technical vocabulary, and we will be referring to things like disinterestedness and saying and said, I would say technically there is no technical vocabulary in Levinas. So that, like Nietzsche, you can't latch onto a word to know what it means. You have to go to the context. So that philosophy, for instance, in Levinas, as much means something bad, namely the philosophy of presence and intellectualism, as it means something good, namely the quest for, the quest for those breakthrough moments. So that the valence of terms depends on the context. And in that sense, there's a rhetoric, I would say. But you're right.
Try to defend in the Levinas.
No, I'm not defending. I'm not defending.
It's your job.
I'm just saying that there's a difficulty because he assumes so much. Now the benefit of this assumption of so much is that someone like me, who have been reading him for decades and decades, I'm still learning from him.
Yeah.
Because he doesn't cheapen his thought. He doesn't popularize his thought. Right? It's thick. It's rich and it's thick. And it's there. What I said earlier about etymologies is so true. With Levinas, you can almost always go into the etymology of a term to find out something more about what he's saying. He knows those etymologies, right? Okay, I'm sorry. Now, second difficulty.
I think it's personal experience of reading Levinas, but it's also my personal experience of teaching Levinas, because I teach Levinas seminars in my department. And there's another one thing I think it's very difficult to teach Levinas is his Jewishness in his philosophies. For us, hopefully for you, Jewish thought is in your blood.
Not in my blood. I've studied it.
Deep into your bone. It's because when I learned Levinas, I learned lots of Jewish thoughts. But later, when I encounter Richard lots of years ago, and we became good friends. And I went to his university, and I actually stayed with him in his house for a few times. Right?
Cooked me a beautiful dinner.
And I learned Levinas as a person, which is to me, is very exciting, and because it's something foreign to me as a Chinese. Okay, so this two things, I think.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
Let me go back to something Raluf has said, and related to what you're saying, because I think we need to be clear about this Jewishness. Levinas does claim a distinction between the confessional writings and the philosophical writings. So let's be clear about what that distinction is, otherwise we'll be sidetracked and we'll have a false difficulty because it's not a real difficulty. The only difference is the rhetorical audience for the writings. Now when I say the only difference is the rhetorical audience for the writings, I mean that what Levinas is saying is exactly the same always, everywhere. There's no, okay, now we've only us Jews together, let's see what we really think.
This is universality.
Right.
Yeah.
There is nothing, it's extraordinary that Levinas is like that. There are other Jewish thinkers that are like that. That is, you closet them away, and you put them in the room with the Jews and the rabbis and the Talmud, and what they're saying could be said in public in the main square. So what makes the writings different? In a Jewish audience, Jews know what the holiday of Rosh Hashanah is. They know what the holiday of Yom Kippur is. They know what Passover is. They don't want Levinas to say, Passover when you eat matzah. In other words, it's a rhetoric of convenience. When we talk as philosophers, we're also doing that. We know what a certain vocabulary means. We know a certain history, so we use shortcuts. Levinas uses all the shortcuts. His writing is very compressed. He only says what he wants to say. Even though it looks sometimes it's repetitious, and sometimes, okay, it's repetition. But in terms of the Jewishness, I think it's very important to say this. And I say that also in contrast to someone like Paul Ricoeur. Because Paul Ricoeur will have Christian writings. And what I mean by that, writings that only make sense for Christians. When Hindus read it, Jews, well not Hindus, they love everything. But I mean, when Jews read it, when Muslims read it, they go, why do I care about this? What is this meaningful? It doesn't mean anything to me. Whereas with Levinas, you can go into his so-called Talmudic readings, and they're for everybody. Now remember, when he does his Talmudic readings at the annual conference of French Jewish intellectuals in Paris, he always apologetically qualifies what he's presenting as not true Talmudic reasoning. And the reason it's not true Talmudic reasoning is that we don't use the word true, but there's a certain Talmudic reasoning that has to do with interpreting the Jewish law for Jews, because that law only applies to Jews, just as American law only applies to Americans, Lithuanian law applies to Lithuanians, the Jewish law applies to Jews. Levinas doesn't do that. He's not even qualified to do that. He's not joking when he's saying he's being humble. He's not qualified. If he were to do that, they'd kick him out of the room. No, they wouldn't, but the people who are qualified would kick him out of the room. I'm not qualified, right? But he's not, and he knows it. What he does do is another kind of reading, which is universal, which they love. The Jewish community loves it. His stuff is, people read it, but it's for everyone. And I want to be clear about that difference. I don't know, not everyone agrees with me about this on Levinas, and therefore some people are wrong.
You're very Levinas.
No, but I mean, either you get it or you don't. In this case, there's no cabal, there's no secret club in Levinas.
One idea I learned from Richard is if there's the only philosopher in the world, it got to be Levinas.
If there was only one, yeah.
Yeah, so anything against Levinas is wrong.
Well, anyway, I haven't even understood it yet. So.
Okay.
Thank you. Any other difficulties people want to add into the mix? What other difficulties? Want to throw more in? Yes.
Well, I don't want to throw a difficulty in the mix. I just want to ask a question. You've talked about the language Levinas employs,
yeah.
And you've also said, and I totally agree with you, that Levinas is trying to say what cannot be said, and you've told us that there are two kinds of philosophers: the one who try this and the one who don't. And my question is, or how should I put it? The philosophers who try to say what cannot be said have a special relationship to language. They understand that the language can be used to some extent in such a way that to say that which cannot be said. So Heidegger has a special relationship to language. He uses special concepts. He calls them, after being in time, he calls them, for example, Inbegriffe. That's concepts who comprise the one who's thinking about them in themselves. And Derrida does it by writing surature, by deleting words. And my question would be, how does Levinas do this?
Mm-hmm.
Is his language metaphorical? Because I agree with you, I don't think it would be right to speak about a rhetorical language. But is it a metaphorical language?
I think Ricoeur was right when he said it was hyperbolic. Yeah, not metaphorical. I think for Levinas that is the problem with Heidegger, and I consider Derrida simply a disciple of Heidegger. So the problem with Heidegger is that he turns to poesis, to languaging, and Levinas will spend a lot of time on this verbality of the verb to be, and he's always referring to Heidegger in that. And although Heidegger is trying to tease something into meaning, it's an aesthetic attempt to catch creativity before it happens, which is, to my mind, an impossibility. There's a subfield in philosophy for the last 30 years called philosophy of creativity. I've never understood this. I say, be creative, and we'll find out what it was afterwards. But you can't know beforehand. And I think Heidegger is a sad case of someone yearning to hear something that he hasn't yet thought of. And he wants to tease it out of the language, of the poesis of the language. And he also refers to etymologies and to beginnings and beginnings before the beginnings, which is an unending process. Whereas with Levinas, the abuse of language is hyperbole to show, you could say it's analogous to negative theology. It's analogous to an analogy. How's that? It's analogous, now I'm talking like Levinas, it's analogous to an analogy. That is to say what you cannot say, the analogy cannot say it either. But it points somehow. That is, Levinas believes that there is, as you know, the trace. It's trace there. And we'll see that the trace in Levinas is very different than the trace in Derrida, therefore, Heidegger.
Heidegger has also a concept of trace, a Spur.
Yeah, of course, but it's not, I would say that Heidegger's thinking always is this poetics of thinking. And Levinas is not doing that. It's much more harsh. It's much more brutal, what Levinas is doing. It's like a slap in the face. So, as Heidegger says, only a God can save it, but that God didn't. But we'll come back. I know we're going to come back many times to Heidegger. We have to come back to Heidegger. That's a good point. In terms of the philosophers that are pointing to... Go on, yes.
I have two difficulties. One is with regard to his conceptual, but I shall not come to that at this point. We were speaking about the understanding, difficulty in terms of understanding Levinas right now,
Yes.
If I am right. And while coming to his texts, except this otherwise than being, other texts are intelligible. But when comes to otherwise than being, it seems to be written very densely, and probably it may be the due to the translation done by Alphonse Lingis. We do not know because I do not know French, so I don't know what is written in original. But while reading Alfonso Lingis' translation, the otherwise than being is find to be a very difficult text and not easily decipherable.
Yes.
His ideas, like we can do it in other texts. It needs repeated reading and meditative reading. Then only the ideas comes up very clearly.
I cannot agree with you more. The chapter 2 of Otherwise Than Being is still my albatross. That's the one chapter I can't really break. Yeah, everything else I think I've broken.
Okay.
But that one, I agree. Otherwise Than Being, particularly chapter 2, something's going on there. I don't know what it is. And I wish I did.
How do you find the original French?
On this point, I can relieve everyone, in my opinion. Also, I have to qualify my opinion by telling you that some of my teachers were Straussians, and Straussians are notorious for saying you must read everything in the original language. So I remember Stanley Rosen coming into the class to teach Machiavelli, and in the very first class telling us that it would be impossible for us to understand this since we're not speaking Italian or Latin. And I resolved ever since then I could care less about original languages. The philosophy is universal, it's translatable. There are certain things that are made easier in some languages, more difficult in others, but it's all translatable. And Levinas's work, because I have translated it, is particularly easy to translate into English. And English is particularly felicitous for Levinas because his French isn't quite French. Right? His French is, you would think, this is someone speaking a foreign language. Of course, it was someone speaking a foreign language, but he had mastered French. I mean, he wasn't lacking in French. There were some words that he uses in French. I don't know where he gets them. I have to consult other people, but they turn out to be French words. What was the one I just found? Traction. Anyone ever hear of traction? It apparently appears twice. Now they have everything on computers. You can search these things. It apparently appears twice in all of Levinas, right? It probably appears twice in the history of French language. Please don't worry. If there were some errors in the translation, I'll point them out. There were some sort of misleading moments. I'll try to point them out. But I'm very happy with the English translations. I don't know how they are in other languages. I have not heard a lot of complaining from people, like that the German translation is bad. Like Heidegger translations, notoriously people complain about, right?
And they are sometimes notoriously bad.
As you said, very possibly. But we were fortunate in English because Lingus was the first translator, and he did Totality and Infinity, Otherwise Than Being, and Existence and Existent, and he did, to my mind, pretty good job. They were tiny little, but they're pretty good jobs.
I just mentioned, because I'm doing utopian, so for me it's very important, the noun side, noun place, the now side. I find it's very, very useful because he discerns now and noun, site and place. It's brilliant for me because I think he's great. He didn't say why he made this distinction, but I can see why, because it's not the place, it's site. It's the dwelling before.
And non-site and null site.
Yeah, and now it's not negation.
Right.
We all know. So it's brilliant for me whenever I refer back to that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. The only, possible one difficulty is that, the French, it might be easier to catch the allusions to other French texts, that. Also, I know that, I know I'm missing some, I have a French translation, the Jewish French translation of the Hebrew Bible, because I'm sure Levinas is making references there, and I don't know it very well, so I know I'm missing some of them. As I know in English, when I write, I make those allusions, but I'm making them to English translations, right? So that in English, the King James Version is sort of the definitive version. Everyone knows it's beautiful, it's poetic, everything's a variation of it. And people know when people are referring to it. They just know from 2 or 3 words that it's from that. And Levinas is Levinas is a little difficult for some philosophers because some of his concepts go back to Hebrew terms. And it used to be when people learned philosophy, they learned Greek, Latin, and Hebrew. But for some reason, in the last 150 years, people are learning Greek and Latin, if they're learning them at all. But they're not learning Hebrew. So that the classics department in my university doesn't teach Hebrew. It's very strange. But they always used to teach Hebrew. That was one of the classic languages. So Levinas will be referring to Hebrew terms. And so I'll try to bring that out when I notice it. But not every reader would get that. And in some ways, some of the things are rhetoric in the sense that they're that pleasure you get from being part of the culture. But it's not just that. It's meaningful. It's meaningful stuff. So don't be, bent out of shape by this. I told you, so I vowed after these teachers that I could care less about this nonsense. Anyway, if we run up against something that the translation is crucial, then we'll say it. And we have French speakers, native French speakers, who will bring our attention to that if they think that we've got something wrong. Okay, so what I wanted to do, in a way it's more of an open discussion and we have a half an hour, is I wanted to go over pages 109 to 151. That's the origin of egoism and self-sensing. And yet, this afternoon, Paul is going to cover pages 143 to 147, so I'm not going to spend time there. The joy of the morrow, the love of life. And Lin Ma will be speaking about enjoyment and separation. Crucial pages 147. So let me begin with, there was another thing I wanted to say about in the difficulties that I left out. Hang on. Oh, maybe I have to add a ninth difficulty. Oh, yes, I'm sorry, there's a ninth difficulty. No, here it is, it's under the second difficulty. Under the second difficulty, namely the phenomenology, the science of evidence rather than the science of objectivity, I want to add this, and this particularly stands out in reading Levinas, and it makes it so hard. In phenomenology, a person does a study, they do an analysis of a region of meaning. Don't mistake an analysis for a region of meaning for the separation of that region of meaning from other levels of meaning. So everything that Levinas discusses in separation is then reevaluated, as it were, in its relationship to alterity. So that when you think of, now I've understood the body in terms of self-sensing, no, this self-sensing becomes vulnerability in relation to the other. So everything has multiple meaning, or at least two meanings that are clearly distinguishable, namely the sphere of immanence, and then the transvaluation of the sphere of immanence in relationship to the sphere of transcendence. And we see this occur first, I think, in the terms of the dwelling. And then, which tomorrow we'll be talking about, and particularly Nicole will talk about the feminine presence. Because we get a form of alterity. So that alterity is operative at all times. And in another area where this causes misinterpretations in Levinas' interpretation, and let me make a terminological thing, just that if we can work with this for this 5 days, you can change it later yourself. I would have preferred that Levinas made this terminological distinction, which he didn't. I would have distinguished ethics, morality, and justice. And I am going to distinguish ethics, morality, and justice for the purposes of this discussion the following way. Ethics is about morality and justice. Right? It's that intellectual discourse where we try to understand what morality and justice are. Morality is the face-to-face relation of responsibility, one to another. That's morality. Again, Levinas does not use the terms the way I'm using them. He will use ethics and morality interchangeably. He will use the word ethics for justice. What I mean by justice is the social, meaning the societal morality, namely the quest for justice. So that, defining justice by justice. What I mean is the care for all others. So that morality is the care for one other, and justice is the care for all others. Now, the reason I mention this distinction in terminology at this moment, where I'm saying in phenomenology the analyses are all happening at once, is that people sometimes mistake the separation analytically of justice and morality for a real separation. There is no face-to-face relation without also justice being in play. And there is no justice without also the face-to-face morality being at play. Now, when I say at play, they can be at play in different ways. So that justice that denies morality becomes tyranny. So that morality that denies justice becomes sentimentality. So for Levinas, they must be at play at the very same time, which, given his theory of time, means not at the same time. Oh, we'll get back to that. Okay, so let's delve into the material, and I want to do it in a strange, you may find it a strange way, but I want to turn to Bergson. Levinas says how important Bergson is to him, and I want to talk about the Iliad, right? The basis of all of Levinas's thought is the Iliad. Right? Levinas builds this magnificent structure of thought. You have the Iliad, you have enjoyment, this happiness, you have enjoyment, this fragility, you have dwelling, then you have labor, then you have representation, then you have the impact of the other, vulnerability, giving, then you have the third, which is in relation to the other, and the concern for politics and justice. It's just unbelievable. It's rich and thick. Right? But where does it begin? It begins with separation from the Iliad. Right? Separation from the Iliad. So, and this, you know, in a way, Levinas, I talked about the maturity of his thought. Thank God he lived as long as he did, because had his life been cut short, as Merleau-Ponty's life was, we would not have had this whole thought. This really took a lifetime to think out and to write out and present to us. So, Bergson writes an article, what year is this article? 1930, The Possible and the Real. I don't know exactly. I tend to think it's in the, like 1911, 1912, but it might be a little later than that. It's in the Creative Mind, and he discusses the false problem of the nothing. This is something Heidegger should have written. If I may express a personal opinion, a personal philosophical opinion, I've always felt that Leibniz's question makes no sense. Why is there something rather than nothing? I've always thought this question itself makes no sense. Because the fact is, there is something. What does it mean to say, why is there something rather than nothing? There it is. Figure it out. The real question is, what sense does its meaning make? What sense can we make of the meaning of what is? Not why is there something rather than nothing. Here it is. Anyway, Bergson takes up this question, and he says the first false problem consists in asking oneself, and I want to talk about the Iliad. I think this is the source of Levinas's understanding of the Iliad. Is why there is being, why something or someone exists. False problem. The nature of what is of little importance. Say that it's matter, or mind, or both, or that matter and mind are not self-sufficient and manifest a transcendent cause. By the way, again, another personal philosophical opinion, Bergson was the last classical French thinker. You will never find this kind of clarity. This French were known for clarity of thinking. Now they're known for idiocy in thinking, right? Deleuze, Foucault, those nuts, you know. But classical French thinking, from Descartes to Bergson, you cannot get clearer thinking. Right? So it doesn't matter what is, matter, mind, both, matter and mind are not self-sufficient and manifest the transcendent cause. In any case, when existences and causes are brought into consideration, and the causes of these causes, one feels as if pressed into a race. If one calls a halt, it is to avoid dizziness. That is the race for the original cause. Right? But just the same, one sees or thinks one sees that the difficulty still exists, that the problem is still there and will never be solved. It will never, in fact, be solved. But it should have never been raised. The problem of where did it all begin? It arises only if one posits a nothingness which supposedly precedes being. One says, there could be nothing, and then is astonished that there should be something. Right? But analyze that sentence. There could be nothing. You will see that you are dealing with words. Not with ideas, not at all with ideas, and that nothing here has no meaning. Nothing is a term in ordinary language which can only have meaning in the sphere proper to man of action and fabrication. Nothing designates the absence of what we are seeking, desire, or expect. Let us suppose that absolute now, doesn't that sound like Levinas? Let us suppose that absolute emptiness. This is when he's talking about the Ilia in existence and existence and time in the other, and in Ilia. Right? Imagine a night with no objects, right? Or an insomnia. So Bergson writes, let us suppose that absolute emptiness was known to our experience. It would be limited, have contours, and therefore would be something. In reality, there is no vacuum. We perceive and can conceive. We perceive and can conceive only occupied space. One thing disappears only because another replaces it. Suppression thus means substitution. This is not substitution in Levinas's sense. We say suppression, however, when we envision, in the case of substitution, only one of its two halves, or rather the one of its two sides which interests us. In this way, we indicate a desire to turn our attention to the object, which is gone, and away from the one replacing it. We say then that there is nothing more, meaning by that what exists does not interest us, that we are interested in what is no longer there, or in what might have been there. The idea of absence, or of nothingness, or of nothing, is therefore inseparably bound to that of suppression, real or eventual, and the idea of suppression is itself only an aspect of the idea of substitution. I'm skipping ahead, although it would be a pleasure to read the whole thing. Don't you hear? This is the source of Levinas's idea of the Iliad. This is where it comes from. Levinas is not kidding when he said that the first contemporary philosopher that had influenced him, he said, besides reading Plato, Kant, and Descartes, was Bergson. That was the start for him. He says, in other words, this so-called representation of absolute emptiness is in reality that of universal fullness. In a mind which leaps indefinitely from part to part with the fixed resolution never to consider anything but the emptiness of its dissatisfaction instead of the fullness of things. All of which amounts to say that the idea of nothing, when it is not that of a simple word, implies as much matter as the idea of all, with an addition, an operation of thought. That is because nothing is more work than all, because nothing is a subtraction of part of something and pretending that nothing is filling its place. So actually all is the easier thought, the plenitude, right? By the way, also I see in this last sentence, all of which amounts to saying that the idea of nothing, when it is not that of a simple word, implies as much matter as the idea of all, with an addition and operation of thought, Levinas's constant reference to the pair of being and nothingness. Or in philosophical terms, his claim that classical philosophy, in the negative sense, revolves around Stoicism and Epicureanism. So that Stoicism says it's all one unity, and Epicureanism says it's just nothing. It's kind of a Dionysian frenzy. Now, Epicureanism isn't exactly the right term because it's Levinas uses it. There are other reasons why he uses it, but the word would be hedonism, right? Or it could be Parmenides, Heraclitus. Right? So the pair Parmenides, Heraclitus is part of this belief that the question, why is there something rather than nothing, makes sense. And Levinas is saying, the question, Bergson is saying, the question doesn't make sense. And that's why Levinas begins, as a phenomenologist, with the phenomena of existence without existence. Right? And he explicitly refers to Heidegger here, being without beings. Right? But in contrast to Heidegger, whose thought revolves on this contrast between beings and being, Levinas will side with beings, the existence, because that's where the action is, the existent. So the origination of the existent is not out of nothing, it's out of the Iliad. And that's why Levinas prefers the word creation to the word cause. Because the word cause as we see in Bergson, leads us back in that infinite regress to the question of the first cause, which is a nonsensical question. A question generated by Kantian thought, that is classical thought, not by the phenomena. The phenomena is plenitude. And there are beings in plenitude that somehow separate themselves out from, or are separated out from plenitude. There is never nothing. There's just the there is. But the there is for Levinas the threat of the dissolution of the separate entity. Right. And the there is then is, interesting enough, the threat to classical philosophy. Because Stoicism, or the identity of the identity in difference, right, the absolute identity, and the dissolution of that identity, so Hegel and Deleuze, right, both of them are threatened by the Iliad. One of them embraces the Iliad, that would be the hedonistic, and one of them flees into the being, into the identity, right, absorbing, as it believes, but falsely, the difference. So one is this flight from the Iliad, one is the flight into the Iliad, and for Levinas that's the parameter of philosophy, classical philosophy. And that's why for him there's a third category, which is indifference to the all and the nothing. Indifference to the all and the nothing, which is non-indifference to the other. Non-indifference to the other is indifference to the opposition of all and nothing. Jim?
I just wanted to get the reference.
Oh.
Creative Mind. Which essay is that?
The possible and the real. And then actually, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I recommend you. The next section, he says there's two ideas that don't make any sense. The notion of absolute order and the notion of absolute disorder. So he shows, it's almost like a precursor of chaos theory. Everything we call disorder is actually an order on a different level. There is no disorder. It's just various orders, depending on what point of view you look at it. That's a very good thought. But the one that's pertinent to us in understanding this Iliad, the elemental, the quality without support. So what Levinas does, in a way, like I said, Husserl more rigorously lays out the theory of time, of duration in Bergson. You find it laid out in its detail in Husserl's writings on inner time consciousness. What Levinas does is a phenomenology of the plenitude that Bergson points us to philosophically. Bergson is content as the breakthrough figure to destroy the parameters in which we previously thought of being and nothingness, and say there's another route. You have to go by another route, but he doesn't develop that route. Or if he does develop that route, he does it in a cosmological way, not in an ethical way. Right? Whereas Levinas does it in an ethical way. So we begin with the there is. This plenitude, we can only point to it. We've never experienced such a thing. You know, in those two early sketchbooks, the images he uses, it's like insomnia, right? It's like the night, right? The noises come from nowhere, right? Sounds from nowhere. It's the witch's brew in Shakespeare, you know, in what is it, in Macbeth. You know, it's the and he'll say in Totality Infinity, it's the mythological form. It has a kind of mythic quality. Now it's interesting that he begins this separation as life with one page that saying that his intent is not anti-intellectualism. Not anti-intellectualism. So this is the kind of gesture you have to make when you do phenomenology in our age of positivism. But I think also there's another meaner or deeper level there. I think, in a way, Levinas sees that Heidegger became anti-intellectual. That there's an anti-intellectualism in Heidegger's thought. There's an attempt, this rootedness in place. And we understand Heidegger wants to escape classical thinking also. He's looking for his way out of the dualistic thinking. But Levinas is opposed to the Heideggerian way out of dualistic thinking through enrootedness. So when he begins by saying this is not anti-intellectualism. So, living from. Here is the level that is not found in Heidegger. In Heidegger, we know when he talks about the original meaning of things, he turns to instrumental totality, the ready to hand. Things are in order to do other things. We're caught up in a complex of ends and means. When a tool breaks down, then we reason about it. Right? Objectivity is derived from praxis. The present at hand derived from the breakdown of the ready to hand, and then the instrumental complex ends in what everything is ultimately for, namely humans. And then what are humans? Being toward death. What is being toward death? Engagement in history. Levinas is saying there's an entire level of signification missing. Now let's put a happy face on Levinas' relation to Heidegger. The happy face is this. Husserlian phenomenology is a science. There is nothing wrong with someone correcting your phenomenological analyses. It's to be expected, it's to be desired, it should be embraced and welcomed. Phenomenology as a science means it's self-regulating, it's self-correcting, it's self-adjusting. So what Levinas does in the course of his career, his philosophical writing, is he corrects every single phenomenological analysis in Heidegger's Being and Time. You can look at it. Every single one will go through a revision in Levinas' hands. So he's saying, yes, Heidegger went through the door first, he saw what phenomenology could do, and now we're correcting it. And Levinas would say, so correct me. No, nothing wrong with that. That's how phenomenology works. Now, we sometimes don't think that about phenomenology, precisely because of the way Heidegger interpreted phenomenology. Heidegger made phenomenology into another philosophy. But Husserl never thought of phenomenology that way. It was a collective work of scientists sharing their research and improving it to figure out how things are, based on the evidence. That's the route that Levinas takes. So I just wrote an article for Routledge as a book on phenomenology, and I wrote a chapter on Levinas. And I try to say Levinas was really, along with Merleau-Ponty, I can't think of the greatest phenomenologist after Husserl. And so Heidegger, Levinas, Merleau-Ponty, three greatest phenomenologists of the 20th century. Michel Henry, another great phenomenologist, but not at the level, I don't think, but still great. And we forget this, because remember I'm saying one of the difficulties of Levinas is that he goes all the way to the end of phenomenology to get to his ethics. But then he has to do a good phenomenology. So what is the layer of signification? We know it's what he calls enjoyment, jouissance, enjoyment. So he's saying, when you take that tool that Heidegger has, when you take the hammer and you hammer it, you enjoy hammering, right? Now, of course, there are moments you don't enjoy when you're being paid 50 cents an hour for 10 hours to hammer something. You don't enjoy, but you still enjoy it. In Levinas' sense, you still have a grip on it. You have a hold on it. The sun is shining on your arm, or you're suffering pain. That's still enjoyment, right? That's enjoyment. There's a level of sensation, he's saying, that is the original level of the separation from the Iliad. Entirely lacking in Heidegger. The only time this comes in Heidegger is, as I said, angst. There's no other body in Heidegger. Angst. For Levinas, jouissance. That is, living from your needs. So that you're hungry, you eat, you're not just instrumentally giving nourishment to an animal body that needs nourishment, a biological entity that needs nourishment. You're chomping down on the food. You're chewing it. You're enjoying that. It's there's an internal finality to those actions. They're not even actions. They're those sensations. They suffice unto themselves, as Levinas would say. And it's that sufficing unto itself that separates you from pure anonymity. It's the origination of the personal. So I think there's three things about this separation in the body, in self-sensing. Merleau-Ponty makes a great deal of it. And this is the heart and soul of Merleau-Ponty, the hand touching the hand. Right? Which hand is touching? It's great, right? There's a circuit of sensation that is you prior to, you know, praxis, prior to representation, and it's the original body, you could say. So one thing about we could say is that it's radical. This is very important. I said that Levinas wanted to deepen the notion of subjectivity. It's radical, and he calls it atheist separation. And he will always use this notion of the risk of atheism. That is, when we separate out from the Iliad, we are truly separated out. It's not a fake separation. It's not like we're going to return to Brahman. We are separate beings. To the bottom. That's why, by the way, as I told you, the connection between transcendence and separation, that's why it is such a trauma, the relation to the other. Because you don't have to have a relation to the other, and yet you can't avoid a relationship to the other. And yet you'd say, of course I can avoid it. If this is radical separation, I can avoid it. Levinas will say you can refuse it, but you can't avoid it. Right? So, radical separation through sensation. It's autochthonous. It's atheist. It's independence, independence, independence. Right? Independence, independence. I live from my needs. Second point, besides it being radical, is what we've already said. It's affectivity, it's sentiment, it's solitude, secrecy, at home with yourself, self-sufficiency. Again, creation, not causality. It's self-sufficient. That's the notion of creation. It's self-sufficient. But it's not a substance. Right? Substance is simply an abstract philosophical way of talking about it, some hylomorphic projection on top of it. This is a phenomenology. This is an account of the evidence of the things themselves without imposing the presuppositions of philosophical or classical thought. And the third thing I would say about the separation is that it's personal, meaning it's existing without a genus. We always think it's the notion of existing without a genus comes from the relation to the other, right? Because the singularization of the individual in relation to the other has nothing to do with species and genus, right? It's singularization rather than individuation. It's not space-time separation like fingerprints. It's non-substitutability. No one else can do what you do. You're elected. But here already, at the level of sensation, we have the singular that is not defined by the genus. So that each human being, or you could say self-sensing entity, because this would be true of animals too, I think. I don't see why this wouldn't be true of animals, would be separate, but not defined by other such animals. Separate on its own. It's the unity of sensing and sense. So he says on page 59, sensation breaks up every system. It's so simple, and yet it's so brilliant. Sensation breaks up every system. He says, behind theory and practice, there is enjoyment of theory and practice. In fact, that's one of the dangers. For those of you who have ever attended a conference, you know there are people who want to hear their own voice. They want to hear the vibration of sound on their throat. It's terrible. We're all susceptible to this. So that's the first point is that, and then what would be the relation, because it is phenomenology, there would be then, we're going to see a relation to the insecurity of that enjoyment, but there's also going to be a relation to the elemental, to the Iliad. So the relation to the Iliad would be a bathing, an absorption, a kind of Dionysian, but you don't lose yourself, unlike the aim of the Dionysian. You're bathing in sensations, and it's constantly happening, and it never goes away. It's our fundamental state in the world. You see this when people are old and dying. What is the primary concern when people are old and dying? That they don't suffer. And I mean physically, they don't suffer. Right? It doesn't matter what their state of mind is. It doesn't matter if they even know who they are. Right? It's the kind of the reduction to the enjoyment. And now medicine is beginning to realize this. You know, so they're setting up hospices and they're giving you great cocktails of every drug there is. Just because the main thing is that you should physically not be suffering at the deepest level of your own personal being. All the rest is a wonderful thing to add on top of it. So he calls it innocent, egoist, alone, satisfied. Right? He also says on page 138, I don't want to jump on the, yeah, this is not someone else's page. He says, in the eyes of reason, the contentment of sensibility is ridiculous. You just hear your mother going, get out of bed. You know, this is, you never get out of bed, Filosofija. You know, you're always Oblomov. In his early writings, he speaks of this in terms of fatigue. You know, when he comes out of the prison camp, where no doubt he was fatigued, right? He had to chop wood, carry wood, but he speaks of this, the body encumbered with itself, the body inescapably on top of itself, weighted down by itself, right? What would Aristotle think? Aristotle, who's at night sleeps with a metal ball in his hand and a shield next to his bed, so when the ball drops, it hits the shield and wakes him up. Because God forbid he should sleep, right? This is sleep. I mean, well, borderline. This is wakefulness, but it's borderline sleep. And this is where our bodies always also are. And this is one of the reasons why ethics is a trauma, because we'd rather not be bothered. Right? The other person is a disturbance. How can the other person be a disturbance if I'm not satisfied with myself? Right? So, no ulterior motive, it's a relishing of life. Think of how all the ascetics would hate this thing. This is the human condition at bottom. It's an animal condition. It's 12, and I am guilty of having hogged all our verbal space. The second hour was meant to be discussion, but we'll have discussion this afternoon because we only have two explications text. And we're going to be covering the very same material. That's how the way I've set it up, is that we do the morning thing and then we do it again in the afternoon. And we do it with everyone else's text much closer to us. So let's, how does our schedule work? We go to lunch, right?
Maybe somebody's dying to ask.
Oh, maybe, I'm sorry, if someone's dying to ask, we're not in such a hurry, our enjoyment is such need that we have to rush to a restaurant. Do people have any comments about what I said, or add to it, or subtract from it, challenge it, or? Yes.
There's a small question about, I'm always confused about when, like, the relationship with nourishment and jouissance, because is there something like play with, right? In jouissance, it's like, I don't think enjoyment has this moment of play with, but jouissance, I think in French, there is a...
Enjoyment. Jouissance, yeah, jouissance sounds a little bit more playful, it does.
Is there, like, because it can have something with disinterestedness, because, I don't know, because he didn't really bring this into Totality Infinity, but for me, this jouissance, there's a moment of disinterestedness in this. I feel like, but enjoyment, you don't really see that.
No, it's not, it's totally personal. There's not, there's no...
But it's, because you play with it, so there's no, like, instrumental.
Yeah, okay, so here I would say that the word jouissance in French is actually misleading us.
Yeah.
That enjoyment is even enjoyment is misleading us, because remember the early studies where it's fatigue.
Yeah.
And it's the burden, the enchainment of the body upon itself. Mm-hmm. I think Levinas is not so interested in saying that it's happy or sad.
No,
it's just stuck with its own sensations, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you're the Kierkegaardian here. But the aesthetic, that you're just absorbed in sensation. Yeah. There's a really nice, I think, description in Heart of Darkness. We've talked about this before, where Marlowe describes when he feels like he's dying and losing himself into this. That's very close to what I think happens in Existence and Existence.
Mm-hmm.
You know, where and then he separates himself from Kurtz, who says the horror. There's a real self-assertion. He admires his work.
So really, enjoyment and jouissance are the misleading terms. But I think rhetorically, it's good that he used those terms, since our prejudice is an ascetic prejudice, as Nietzsche reveals. Our prejudice is against the body. So this new thinking, which takes seriously time, the body, language, probably has to move a little bit in the other direction.
So it's more nourishment.
It's nourishment
Yes, it's
or
better.
relishing, but even those words.
But I think jouissance does work in a sense too, you know, because you're talking about just being separate.
Right.
And there's the great line at the end of Seventh Seal where Jan's the squire says, as long as you can, you're here as long as you can wiggle your toes.
Exactly.
Yes.
Yes. So you're right.
Stop giving yourself up to the absolute.
You're right. So it is an enjoyment.
Even
in the pain.
Yeah.
Even in the pain.
But
That's why
also,
you have sometimes you hear old people when they say, "How are you?" They go, "Still here."
And they do love to talk about their pain.
also maybe we could defend the term both English and French in the sense that it's an underlying intention, the primordial intention of the living bodies to be comfortable, to enjoy what's happening around. So in that sense, maybe it can be enjoyment. And I'm thinking about the aesthete, because that's the point of the Kierkegaardian aesthete, to enjoy life, just whatever happens around. That's the point of living life, And then you have a break, and then you turn to ethical.
I would agree partially. I would say that originally Levinas does not want to think of this as an intention.
It's
The
not the
aesthete makes it into an intention, but in ethics it becomes what you want for the other. That is, it has a norm. Once we bring this into the face of the other, these analyses, in terms of that revaluation I said, then it becomes a norm. That is, when Levinas says, "I give the other the food that I eat," it's because I enjoy the food, that I know the other lacks the food, and that I would give it to the other. So it doesn't become, except for the aesthete, my intention, but in the ethical level, it becomes my intention that the other should have.
Yeah, I know that the word is wrong. I don't find the better word, because intention is misleading here. It's not kind of reflected intention. That's why I said the underlying intention. It's kind of the point of the existence as such is to be comfortable, to take space in the world. In that sense, it's seeking enjoyment. And then, of course, when it becomes ethical, that's what you want for the other.
Oh, yes.
With this, even at the price of sacrificing your own space.
No, and this is why he puts Pascal as one of his epigrams.
User.
Where is it? Is it in Totalitarian or otherwise?
It's otherwise in
That he uses
the user, like
the usurpation. He says, "This is my place in the sun."
Exactly.
This is how the usurpation of the whole world began. So that you're absolutely, because this is the beginning, everything depends on my relationship to it. If I make this my goal, then the usurpation of the world occurs. If I make it my goal that the other have this, we have an ethical world.
Yeah, exactly. But so to come back to enjoyment, I think it's a good word when we think that it's basically about taking place in the world, having some space for yourself.
Yeah. This is partly why when we came up with the title for Thursday's evening discussion, we called it Joyful Ethics, because you have to have something that's sexy and attracts people. And I thought that people would catch the resonance with the first English translation of Nietzsche's Gay Science, which was called Joyful Wisdom. So I'm hoping the discussion Thursday night will be the contrast between these two great ethicists, Nietzsche and Levinas. And this would be one of the points in Levinas's defense. That there is a joy in ethics. It may not be your own though.
Right.
I have I have always some difficulty with Heidegger's, Levinas's reading of Heidegger's project as a project for enjoyment of Dasein. And I feel that Levinas is taking into account only the Heidegger of being and time, he does not properly refer or touches upon the later writings of Heidegger. And while coming to the being and time as well, Heidegger merely explicates the Dasein's average every mode of existence as immersing in enjoyment. And I always feel that Heidegger is not prescribing that should be the way of life. There is possibility for radically Dasein shift, make a choice and shift away from such an immersion. And there is a possibility for exceptional living as well. That is explicated in authentic living. But Heidegger may not be showing the proper way, means for what shall be that authentic living and all. But I feel that he phenomenologically only explicating the average everyday mode of Dasein's existence. This cannot be the entire story of Heidegger's project.
Different reading of Heidegger. I don't see the same. I don't see the. I think it moves from a phenomenological position to a linguistic position after being in time. So I don't even think these are issues anymore after being in time. And it's true, being in time I think is warped because of his concern for being. But in order to get to being, this was a propedeutic. It was like his phenomenology of spirit to get to the logic. So I don't think he left anything out. I mean, I think he did leave things out, but I don't think he intended to. So I'm not so sure I understand. But
We have to
We had Heidegger's experts.
there's you answered.
I think you're right when you said that he left some things out, but he did it on purpose. And his scope in Being and Time was just to raise once more the question about being he was so fascinated about. Before Being and Time, in the lectures he held in Freiburg, for example, he talks about life. He almost never talks about being until Gesamtausgabe 62, 63, Ontology, Hermeneutics of Facticity, when he starts raising the question about the being of Dasein and the question about the being as such. But before that, he's talking about life, and he's talking about the facticity of life, and I think he is conscious of the fact that he doesn't discuss the body, he doesn't discuss the other in Being and Time, and there are some books, some lectures, a lecture on Leibniz, where he speaks about meta-ontology, where he says this is where we could talk about the alterity, this is where we could talk about ethics, this is where we could talk about the body. So his purpose in Being and Time was not to do an anthropological study. He was just trying to reach to this question of being and to understand being in the light of time. This was his endeavor, and he failed to do that. And I wouldn't agree with you when you say that he turned to a linguistic paradigm or to I think that being remained his focus, but what he was trying to do was to understand the being without the Dasein, or not to ask the question of being starting from the Dasein, because when you look at Being and Time, you see that it's the last metaphysical work of Western thinking. It's a work where the metaphysics is brought to its limits and implodes. So it's the last work where the question of ground is asked. So this is why he later on never asked this question starting with Dasein, but he tries to understand being starting from the being itself, so to say, as something that is given to us. As Kiptilia is basically a Heideggerian concept, and this is where Heidegger turns to poetics also, because he thinks that the language is the house of being, as he puts it. He thinks that the language can give us an access to being as such.
No, this we know, and this is why I said it. It's like his phenomenology of spirits, and then he moves to the logic. So he does his being in time, that's the propedeutic, then we go to being speaking. But I just think that entire structure is determined by classical thinking, and I think that if he's going to do the propedeutic, climb up the ladder, then it should be much more rich, than such as Hegel does, although distorted by the propositional logic that drives the phenomenology towards certainty, so that it doesn't work to come back later and say, oh, here's the place for the body, here's the place for ethics. He already establishes in Being in Time that ethics will be ontic.
That's right.
Right. So,
That's right.
It's a completely different perspective. In fact, for Levinas, and I would agree that what is great about Being in Time is not its ontology. That's what distorts the book. What's great about it are its phenomenological studies. And Heidegger did not pursue phenomenology in the end. He moved on. He did something else, ontology. So I don't disagree with that. But insofar as it is a phenomenological world, and therefore we can think of it outside of the project of ontology that he goes on, it's missing a lot. It's really missing a lot. Levinas is saying it's missing one of the most fundamental levels. But we could go on and on. Levinas will also criticize the whole idea of being toward death, in terms of the transcendence of death and the meaning of death. And when you challenge the meaning of death, then you're also ultimately challenging the placement of Dasein within history. And if you're challenging the placement of Dasein within history, then you're challenging the character of the dialogue or the hearing of the being speaking. So it's a fundamental criticism, but I don't think it's, as some Heideggerians might want to think, I don't think it's because Levinas misunderstood Heidegger. I think he just really disagrees both with the phenomenology and with the framing of phenomenology within ontology. That is, for Levinas, that's a step back into classical philosophy, the framing of phenomenology within ontology, and that and to shift to the S gift. This is a classic maneuver of ontology for Hegel. It's spirit that gives. Spirit gives. It's the same structure.
Yeah, but with the difference that by Heidegger nobody gives. This is the problem. As
Nobody's giving
it doesn't
Hegel.
have a subject.
Nobody's giving him Hegel. History unfolds itself.
And repeat itself.
Yeah.
And repeat itself.
Does it repeat itself? as comedy?
Tragedy, actually.
But we'll continue. I think Levinas is very much aware that Heidegger went off on a different project.
Well, there's a point where I have to disagree with you, and I think that in a way, and I'm going to speak about this today. In a way, Levinas' phenomenology is methodologically speaking closer to Heideggerian phenomenology than to the Husserlian phenomenology. And when I say that, I mean that it's not a reflexive phenomenology, but a hermeneutical phenomenology. That means that for Levinas, as well as for Heidegger, the starting point of phenomenology is the sensation, is the Befindlichkeit, the moods. So
Levinas will agree that one of the great things about Being in Time is that it's stimulus, that it begins in mood, but it doesn't have a correct account of it. That's all.
well, I wouldn't say.
We talk about it after lunch.
Yes.
We're living for food.
Okay, so this will continue.
Yeah, of course.
This will continue. So where are we going?